to begin this screencast with the bullet, the emergence of an African community. And you may have these notes already taken, so if so, just fast forward to resistance and accommodation, but I am going to start here. So planters tried to keep their slave population diverse, meaning they wanted to keep them as coming from different areas. They wanted them to come from different areas of Africa. They wanted to do this so that they would have all different languages and cultures, so they could prevent rebellion or any kind of slave uprising. Now, even though it's their goal that a slave community not develop, it's going to happen anyway. And I have several examples of how a sense of African community emerged in the British colonies. The first is the language known as Gullah, and I have that spelled on the screencast. It's Gullah. Gullah was a language developed by the slaves. It was a cross between English and some African languages. The second example I have of African community are strong family ties. In many cases, there were traditional marriages or children within African communities, even though any person within a family could be bought and sold at any time. And my last example is religion. Many African slaves brought with them their religion that they practiced in Africa. So many maintained their religious beliefs. Okay, moving on to resistance and accommodation. So many resist protest against their slave owners in silent form, meaning they're not doing so directly. They could work slowly when out in the field, meaning they're not harvesting as many crops, which means they're costing the slave owner money. Or they would also often break tools so that they could not work. But there are some examples of a planned slave uprising. So the main example that we're going to go over is the Stono Rebellion. And the Stono Rebellion happened in South Carolina. And I'll give you a little background about it. So, the governor of Spanish Florida offered freedom to slaves within Florida. So you could imagine that some slaves have this idea that if they make it to Florida, they would earn their freedom. So a group of about 20 slaves met at the Stono River. They brought weapons with them, and they planned to attempt to flee to Florida. Now, truth is, 20 people is not a very large amount of people, so it's not going to be a successful rebellion. They were able to kill some of the rebels along the way. Kill some, not rebels. They were able to kill some white families, but eventually the rebellion would be put down. And many of the rebels would end up being killed. Many of these slaves would end up being killed. So this rebellion was not successful, but it is an example of a slave uprising or an attempted slave uprising. It's not going to happen super often, but it does happen, and the effect of this rebellion is going to be that there's going to be stricter laws for the slaves living in South Carolina to kind of teach them a lesson and not lead them to want to try this ever again. So I want to quickly talk about the different economies that are developing between like the South and the North, and this kind of gives you an idea of why there are so many differences between the northern and southern colonies and eventually the northern and southern states as we progress in American history. So I'll start with the southern gentry. So there was a social hierarchy within the Chesapeake and South Carolina. And you know what I mean by social hierarchy is a social ladder. You essentially had wealthy plantation and landowners at the top of that hierarchy, or at the top of that social ladder. So poor farmers living in the South were encouraged to invest in both land and slaves. By the late 1700s, about 60% of English families in the Chesapeake owned slaves. That's a huge, percentage. So it just kind of shows you how developed this, or how far the slave labor system is going in the Americas and in the South specifically at this time. The North is a little bit different, so we're going to talk about next the northern maritime economy. And when you hear the term maritime, it should make you think of the water. Okay? So northern British colonies were very involved in the triangular trade network. The triangular trade network. They exported goods such as lumber, meat, bread, and fish out of northern ports. You can really see how different the North and the South are even this early on, because you know that most of these goods like lumber and meats, they don't really require slave labor. So the northern economy is really not as invested in the slave labor system as the South is from very early on. The last thing we're going to talk about really quickly is the idea of salutary neglect. And if you look at the slide on my PowerPoint, you'll see two English monarchs, George I and George II, and you can tell the genes are strong with them because they look very, very similar, but they are two different people. So I want you to know that during the reign of these two kings, George I and George II, leaders in England were more concerned about affairs happening within England. Meaning they are turning their attention away from their colonies. They're more concerned about what's happening in the mother country. Okay, this period of time is known as salutary neglect. And it's kind of, in a way, an oxymoron, because the word neglect, means to kind of forget and to not mess with and to leave alone. But salutary means beneficial, good, favorable. It should kind of remind you of the term like salutations. Okay? So basically this term means positive or beneficial neglect. Why is it beneficial neglect? Because the colonies are very happy that England is not very concerned or not very actively involved with them at this time. Because they're given the freedom to develop their own legislatures and pass their own laws and their own taxes. So the reason it's called salutary neglect is because the colonies are happy that the mother country is kind of leaving them be. They still own the colonies, but at least they're allowed to exist a little more freely and independently. And that's all of the screencast I wanted to get through, all the notes I wanted to get through today. So listen to the screencast, write down questions, highlight things you're confused about. We have a very, very brief note or two left to discuss on Monday, and then we'll review for our unit tests, all right? Be sure you study this weekend. Good luck with that, and let me know if you have questions.